what really elevated him to the rank of the kind of world-beating economist was his explanation of the Great Depression in the monetary history. And I want to come back to that one. But for now, how did the Great Depression shape his thinking? And I guess a little later, World War II played a big part as well, and maybe made Milton Friedman, he's clearly in the tradition that goes back to Adam Smith and the classical economists, but his liberalism was a little different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think there's a couple things about that. It's really, the timing turns out to be really important. So he gets to Chicago in 1932. It's really the worst part of the Great Depression. And there's a couple things he's going to get from his teachers and from that environment. The first is like, do something, do anything. I was surprised to find in my research, Chicago professors were very activist in calling for a very active federal government. They clearly saw this was an emergency. They clearly saw the government needed to spend for relief, needed to do what it could. And so Friedman picked up that ethos. And that came wrapped in a real fear of inequality within capitalist societies. And if inequality became too pervasive in a situation like the Great Depression, it would just lead to the end of the capitalist system. So professors of his like Frank Knight and Henry Simons were really trying to rethink these principles of liberalism. So you get that grounding of, okay, I have my first principles. I'm a believer in what we would call classical liberalism, but I'm seeing that in this world of mass democracy, social movements, communism, fascism, I can't just keep saying the same thing over and over again. I have to rethink it. So he's part of that from a very young age. The second piece that happens is he gets the Chicago interpretation of the Great Depression as a monetary crisis, as one centered in a banking and financial system that then spreads out into a broader crisis. So then a couple years later, when the ideas of John Maynard Keynes become over to the United States, and it seems like the explanation that we've been waiting for, Friedman already has a take, and he feels very solid in that take. And so again, it's just a matter of years. The vast majority of Keynesian economists who shape the profession are just like 3 to 4 years older than him, but it puts them in a different place in their education when they encounter Keynesianism. So I can see from the record that he's very skeptical of the general theory from the beginning, as are his professors. He thinks it's interesting. He thinks it's like very creative. He doesn't think it's the explanation of the Great Depression. The sort of be all and end all. So that's very important.
And that leads to an interesting point, actually, because, for a while, Milton Friedman was in New York, he was in Washington, D.C., he was working for government agencies during the Second World War. And Milton Friedman, I think himself has said, I can't believe how Keynesian I was at the time. But you kind of take that argument apart and you show, actually, he was no kind of Keynesian at all. Maybe he appeared to be because of wartime circumstances or whatever. But actually, he had that Chicago core to his thinking, price theory, quantity theory of money all along. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, I think that is a fair summation. So there wasn't, like a road to Damascus moment where suddenly he changed from being a New Deal liberal to something else. And what I really try to do is add context. I feel like that's really important to my mission. It's like, okay, there's so many reasons for Milton Friedman to vote Democratic. By his recollection, his first vote is cast for Roosevelt. One is the just backdrop of Hitler in Europe, right, and all that isolationism I just discussed. That's a compelling reason to say I'm voting for Roosevelt because I feel like he's most likely to do something about the situation in Europe. And then he worked for the New Deal because there were no other jobs. He was very happy to take it. So what I really tried to do, though, was contextualize. Here's Friedman saying, let's raise taxes to stop inflation. Well, that does sound Keynesian, but what is the other option? Let's institute price controls throughout the economy. Well, he's choosing from a sort of menu. And then I also look just who are the Keynesian economists? Who are they hanging out with? What are their networks? And is Friedman part of them? Like, no, he's not. So he has these ideas on monetarism and what we would call monetarism. They do shift over time, in part because of the architecture of how the Fed and the Treasury Department interact changes. But he's looking from the beginning at inflation as a monetary phenomenon. He's looking at the money and banking system as like this sort of baseline shaper of aggregate economic activity. And so that's distinctive and that stays with him.
Interesting. And there's something which is in the early Chicago plan and that Milton Friedman seems to carry with him through much of his career. But I don't know whether he ever abandons the idea, but this is kind of 100% reserve
100%
banking.
Money, 100%
and,
money,
I don't want to go down this rabbit hole.
I'm so glad
You've
you're
met enough
asking about
libertarians
it.
to know how it goes. But what was the deal there?
So this is so interesting. And again, I can't normally geek out on 100% money, but this was Henry Simon's idea that you basically should eliminate fractional reserve banking. Like you should just have the money you have and you can't, loan against it. And then you would create, that would be your regular banking system, and then you would have an investment banking system that would be parallel. So this goes to the influence of Henry Simons, who is a young professor. He's not even really a professor. He's kind of an advanced graduate student. And he has this very unique blend of sort of egalitarian free market synthesis. So there's some sectors that the government should run because they're natural monopolies, up to and including railroads and utilities. And after that, you should just kind of let the market do its work. It's really, I consider it an iteration on Henry George. It's like a nuevo Henry Georgeism. And so he's really important in Friedman's mental universe. And then he tragically dies in what appears to be a suicide right as Friedman gets back to Chicago. And so the sort of ghost of Henry Simons is with Milton Friedman for a long time. He's even talking about 100% money, I think, into the early 60s, and then eventually he just drops. But you can really see him thinking about it. And that just goes back to, in the beginning, Friedman is willing to call for significant government intervention in the banking and financial system. That's what his professors are calling for. It's what he's continuing to call for. And even, to some extent, more democratic accountability for the Federal Reserve. I mean, he attacks the Fed from many directions, but one of them is the Federal Reserve has too much power. It's an unelected group of men with too much power. So there is a little bit of that flavor of Simons left in him throughout his career, but 100% money eventually falls by the wayside.